citizen, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome to another episode of our weekly program, The People-Powered Planet. Each week on our People-Powered Planet podcast, we have exciting guests who are not just telling us more of the overwhelming problems in the world, but what are some of the key solutions? How can we, the people, come together and begin to create the world that we really all want to, the world that each person is striving for in their hopes and dreams? Our very special guest today comes to us on what used to be called Veterans Day, or in fact, was not. I'll ask him about that. Some people have mistakenly called it Veterans Day, but it's really Armistice Day. This is a day where we celebrate peace. We celebrate armistice. And Danny's going to tell us a little bit more about how that got misnamed. But meanwhile, Danny's a very special guest. He's a retired major in the U.S. Army. He was teaching at Westpoint. He's teaching some of these generals and admirals and others. And he was deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and faced combat firsthand. And yet, right from his war experiences, he did an about face. And now has an incredible podcast called Fortress on the Hill, has written a book, Patriotic Dissent, has done many more things which we'll be hearing about. But I've listened to a number of his podcasts, and they're very powerful. He recently had a wonderful guest on, Christian Sorensen, who was talking about, the thing Eisenhower warned us about the danger of the military-industrial complex in every state house, every part of our government could subvert our democracy, destroy any change. Well, he said that every gun that is made, every warship launched represents in the final sense a theft from those who are hungry and not fed, or a robbery from those who are cold and not clothed. He's warned that we had to turn this around about the military-industrial complex, or our economy, our future livelihood would be in trouble. So Danny will tell us a little later about his institute he has on Eisenhower, and Eisenhower opens my film, The World is War Without Winners, which you can see by just going to warwithoutwinners.com. You can see that whole original quote. Danny, let's start off by, let's first have you tell us a little bit more about you and what led to your about face, and then maybe either before or after that, tell us why Armistice Day is such an important day for us to be talking to you about this.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Really glad to do this, talk about these issues. I like everything about sort of the viewpoint and the global perspective, and the fact that we're talking about people and peace. And those are words that don't even get broached very much anymore in the mainstream. I've told my own story so many times that I start to wonder if it's a different guy. You tell it a little differently every time. That's part of memory and different points in your life. But suffice it to say, I'm not from a military family. I'm not from a particularly intellectual and educated family in Staten Island, New York. I, went to West Point. I had always wanted to be in the Army. It was a bit of a whim that I ended up going to West Point. It was a bit of a surprise, big thing in the family, obviously. Did fairly well in the Army, but bottom line, my doubts developed slowly when the lies surrounding the Iraq War kind of came to light. And really, they should have been obvious to many of us from the start. I'm a little bit embarrassed how long it took me. Nevertheless, going to Iraq as part of, or just before the surge, and then serving there in a 15-month tour, 2006 to right up to New Year's Eve, 2007, I was there for the early part of the surge, just before the surge, and I guess I saw there was a massive mismatch between what we were told we were there to do and what we were actually doing, and that really changed me forever.
What is it we were actually doing that you saw firsthand?
I mean, the truth is, first of all, we were told we were there to fight terror, right, to stop a mushroom cloud from hitting an American city, and because Saddam had been working with Al-Qaeda. Of course, that proved to all be fabricated. And then after that, it was, well, we're there to create democracy, right? To bring American values and Jeffersonian democracy on the Tigris and the Euphrates. And of course, the reality is we had catalyzed the Civil War that we should have been able to predict, because we took that society apart in the process. the various sects fell apart, along with the government. So what we were doing was we were policing and party to a civil war that eventually kills about 1 million people. And so I found myself in the middle of that. And it was very hard to square my own role, understanding that even if I didn't go out every day trying to kill civilians, certainly my government and my presence had created much of this problem. So I think the big thing for me, I've always been a bit of a sensitive kid. Probably the Army in many ways was a bad choice, right, or a bad fit. On paper, that wasn't the case, but in practice, that's what I was feeling. So the amount of death that I really sort of witnessed, mostly Iraqi on Iraqi, but very much with American, sort of catalyzation, with American collaboration in a way. So I'm not obviating us a responsibility. That really turned me. But I was a professional mercenary. I stayed in the military for a number of reasons, mostly bad. I like gold stars and I like socialist healthcare. And that was my identity. So the reality is I stayed in long after I was personally dissenting, did Afghanistan, saw a lot of the same things. And however, when I fell apart sort of mentally, frankly, and couldn't get out of bed during grad school after I'd been accepted to go back and teach at Westpoint, we're talking 2013, 14, I wrote a book on a whim, manic style, locked myself in my bedroom. And that was my first book, Ghost Riders of Baghdad. That sort of opened a floodgate intellectually and ethically. I started writing lots of articles. I was still on active duty. The Army didn't like that. I was in no mental state to continue, frankly, anyway. So we had one of those rare, mutual breakups. Conscious uncoupling, I believe, is what Gwyneth Paltrow calls it when it's a romantic relationship. And ever since then, it's kind of history. And this is what I do full time.
Great. And so tell us, why is it so special that we're talking to you on Armistice Day?
Well, I'm a historian as well and a hyper geek. The fact is that this day, in fact, the minute of the hour of this day, the 11th minute of the 11th hour, right, of the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11, 1918, was the armistice that ended the worst mechanistic industrial killing in the history of human warfare up to that point, World War I. It had a resonance, a hope, and a warning that has been utterly lost when we changed it to Veterans Day. And what that was this idea that nationalism, hyper-patriotism, had lost its utility to a certain extent when 9 million, right, young men mostly of a variety of countries decided to fight each other needlessly in the trenches, including the United States, which was a latecomer, but had massive casualties in a very short period, okay? The idea of Armistice Day was a warning and it was a hope. And so the warning was never again, right? Never again, the war to end all wars. We will never fall for this again. And the hope was that this was the last of these wars. There would be peace. It was at least an aspirational holiday. Of course, for a number of reasons, World War II comes and really war has never stopped since then. Some people would say that the old idea of Armistice Day was a pipe dream. So what did they do? They said, well, we're going to keep the day, but we're going to rename it, at least in the United States. We'll call it Veterans Day, because if you call it Veterans Day and you never stop your wars, there'll always be a reason to have a holiday. I'm waiting for the Armistice Day, which is what I still called it. When we wake up, I won't be alive, but when my kids' wake up and say, I don't even know why we have this Veterans Day anymore, because all the veterans are dead, because we don't have wars that are useless and unnecessary anymore. That may sound, again, naive and idealistic, but I think that we lose something when we get rid of the old idea of Armistice Day.
Tell us a little bit more about some of that you mentioned this Eisenhower Institute you have. Tell me more about that.
So one of the things that I noticed when I walked into dissent, when I sort of fumbled into writing, accidentally became professional. One of the things I noticed is that, well, first of all, I found out that there's not a lot of public military veteran dissenters. There are lots of military veteran dissenters, but there weren't a lot of public writers, public voices, at least that were getting any traction, because you'll be silenced, frankly. Not overtly through like prison or anything like that. Usually you're just ignored, right? You just can't get published. So I found quickly that there aren't a whole lot of us. And then it didn't take but a year or two of getting into this game to realize that suddenly I had all their numbers in my phone. And I'm talking about, the Baseviches and the Danny Davises and the Matt Hoes, right? Some of the guys that have gotten a little traction, mostly officers, but not exclusively. There were so few that I knew all of them personally, right? And then that was actually disturbing in a way. But what I found is, okay, there are lots of voices that aren't getting heard. There are a number, probably, 24, who are getting heard to some extent. But among that 24, let's say, they're working in a lot of different areas, right? Who writes here, who works at this institute. And so everyone was kind of doing their own thing, aligned in our goals largely, but without focus. So one of the things that, I dreamed up, frankly, with really the genesis of Ben Cohen. I'm talking Ben, the minister of ice cream, as Senator Nina Turner calls him. Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's reached out to me about 3 years ago. I thought it was a prank email. My ex-wife said, no, that's got a at Ben & Jerry's email address. You should answer this. And we've developed a bit of a relationship, professionally and personally. And we dreamed this up together at brunch in New York about 3 years ago. The idea being that, what's really needed is not necessarily another think tank. It's getting these anti-war veteran voices, mostly military, but also like FBI, CIA, anybody in the national security state who's skeptical, who's critical of American foreign policy. How do we get them linked in some way? How do we get them linked and focused? And how do we use whatever resources are at our disposal to get them in as much media as possible? So we're talking from the alternative media to the mid-range to the high-end mainstream media. Now that's a challenge, but that's our goal. So we are as much a alignment and a booking agency as anything else. And we're just launching now. We're kind of doing a slow launch. You'll see more of us. We've got 10 fellows who are on staff. They range from former enlisted Air Force Arabic linguist, Christian Sorensen, who studies the military-industrial complex, up to Major General Dennis Leitch. Okay, and we've got people like Larry Wilkerson and Colleen Rowley there in the middle. So we've got some prominent voices, we've got some new voices, and we're trying to book them and place them as much in a variety of media and reach as much audience as possible. Because what we want to do is provide an independent line that isn't owned tacitly or overtly by the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex. So that's what we bring, is people who've been there, done that, learned something from it, and want to challenge the paradigm. So I'm directing that in a co-founded project with Ben, and we are very hopeful, and we are continuing to recruit. So if you have any names, you email me, and if you're listening to this and you meet the profile, send me an email. My website, Skeptical Vet, has a contact me page that'll take you right to my Hotmail, which I found is a really great way to get a significant amount of hate mail.
Wow. Well, that sounds like an incredibly important thing. I worked for 7 years for Admiral Iraq, who headed the Center for Defense Information. It was a group of retired admirals and generals, General Gorwitz, numerous top-level military people who were speaking out for peace. And he was Admiral Iraq was was a key. His key combat came in Pearl Harbor, and he experienced all that. And yet he was his kids were marching on the Pentagon at the same time that he was planning nuclear war. And he began to realize that you can't fight, there's no way you can fight and defend your country against a nuclear war. You have to avert it. And he quit and joined up with some actually Quakers who helped him get started. The people from Friends Committee on National Legislation and others helped him get started with the Center for Defense Information. And that's where I made the film that I mentioned with Eisenhower called War Without Winners, warwithoutwinners.com. But so back to you on that, I really salute you carrying that on now. I can't refer you to people because the people I knew have passed on, but I think it's wonderful you're bringing people from the military into this because their voices are so important to be heard. Tell us a little bit more about how do you see tackling this kind of aura that's been built around the military that makes it sort of a sacred cow. I was in the San Diego airport when it came on the loudspeaker. They asked everyone to pause while they gave a special salute to some World War II veterans who were coming in. And I wanted to take the mic and say, well, let's salute the teachers and the nurses and some of the other key people who are serving their community. But why is there this kind of sacred cow mentality, and how do you see beginning to break that down?
It's funny you should say that. I'm single, believe it or not. Who can imagine? And but for some reason, I tend to attract social workers, teachers, nurses. Right? Probably says something about me more than anything else. And I often say that to them, and I think they think it's a line early on, like that it's obscene in a republic, right? A self-styled republic, maybe even a democracy almost, that we fetishize killers, state killers. Now, whether or not, even if you believe we need a military, even if you believe that there are some wars worth fighting, it is an odd thing indeed to go as far as we have, to foreground state killers on the 50-yard line. Okay, that's who's there, right? Not social workers, not teachers, not nurses, not even research scientists. So there's something kind of grotesque about that. And I do think it speaks to a sick society. It is also an unhealthy thing for a republic when in poll after poll for year after year, now decade after decade, showing that the only public institution with over 50% regular support and trust of the people is the US military. Now, a lot of soldiers look at that and we all like pats on the back. I love gold stars. I love positive reinforcement. I'm a human being, right? I'm an American male. Delusion is my birthright, okay? But I think that it starts, at least on the veteran side, with rejecting that, rejecting the fetishization. It doesn't mean rejecting the thanks and being rude. It means being big enough to say that actually what I was a part of might in fact not have been in the best interest of the world, my country, or humanity. And that even if it were, it maybe is something that should be dealt with rather more humility and circumspection, right? The idea that I reject that I should be the one on the Jumbotron. And I've been on the Jumbotron in Kansas City for the Royals, right after Garth Brooks sings, Friends in Low Places. I was there, I did that, okay? It's kind of gross though, and I wish that I hadn't. And so I think that on the veteran side, it involves us saying, look, I've got the confidence intellectually and ethically to say, I shouldn't be the hero of the society or the sole hero of the society. And then the second thing is, I think we've got to tell the truth. And this just isn't a veteran issue. This is across the board. We've got to be willing to question all the sacred cows, including the support the troops cult. We've got to be willing to question, things like inerrant support of Israel and being the #1 arms dealer in the world and having 800 bases in who knows how many countries. All these things are unique and exceptional to America, but they're exceptional in all the wrong ways. And I think we've got to be willing to call that out and question it, because CNN, MSNBC, right, the liberal media, they're not going to do it, because if you look at the generals that they put on TV and the CIA agents that they put on TV, and they put plenty on TV, they put as many as Fox now, if not more, okay? The ones they choose, they're not the kind of folks that I'm recruiting at the Eisenhower Media Network. They're given the party line, and in many cases, they're in the pocket of the military-industrial consultancy industry complex. And so I think we've got to reject that, and that's going to happen at the grassroots. Your salvation will not come from the generals. Your salvation will not come from the congressional leaders. It's going to come from the streets. That sounds like a platitude, but there is a historical record that shows us that real change comes from the bottom. And the top folks, they only move late and when they feel they have no choice. That's been the record. That's the historical record.
So what do you think? You mentioned a shift at the top. We, of course, have just come through an election which had terrific emotional impact for people around the world and in this country. What is your feeling about what shift that foretells and what it doesn't?
My biggest fear is that we're going to see 2009, January 2009 all over again, which is to say that when somebody who was really just an awful war criminal of a president, George W. Bush, who has now, of course, been sanitized and canonized as polite, but when we saw George W. Bush leave and Obama came in. And I was on the Obama train, I'm not going to lie, right? I was very excited about him. I had a lot of hope for him. But when he came in, the anti-war movement, such as it existed, went underground, or it was suppressed, okay? There were still folks out there doing it. Their voices just weren't being heard. And a lot of people who've been very critical of the war on terror when Bush was running it suddenly didn't say a whole lot about drone strikes, didn't say a whole lot about the escalation of the war in Afghanistan, regime change in Libya, you name it. My biggest fear is that much of the dissent that we saw, especially in 2017 and 18, and really coming through to today, was more anti-Trump than anti-war, was more anti-Trump than anti-systemic racism, and was more anti-Trump than anti-military industrial complex. I think our challenge is to say, yes, we are glad Trump is gone, but immediately today, and certainly on January 20th, we are not going to accept a Biden presidency and a Biden foreign policy team that we are seeing shake out that is going to be just a polite emperor and his polite imperial minions. I think that we have to actually challenge the system, challenge the sacred cows, and hold this new president to account. Because if the idea is that Biden is going to save us, then I think that we're asking for more of the same. And so it's going to take courage, by the way, to stay in those streets, to stay active, to stay on the phones, and to be willing to challenge a president who, according to many, and there's some truth in this, is a better alternative, I guess, at least in personality and in some policy, to say Trump. But I don't think we can let the fire down for a second. And I'm terrified that we will. And if we follow the lead of CNN, we most certainly will. Because they think the battle's won and all is well, but it is not well. This is a sick society.
And you recently had a podcast where you played clips of Biden's role in the Iraq War and other promotion of the military-industrial complex. Tell us a moment more about that, and whether you think there's a chance now that he'll turn that around. Well,
I'm of two minds about Joe Biden and Joe Biden's foreign policy. I did, with my co-host Henry Hendrickson on Fortress on a Hill, do an episode right before the election on Biden's foreign policy record. I cannot tell you the amount of hate mail, and some of it collegial and some of it threatening, that I got in response to that. You see, because the idea was that by questioning Biden, despite the fact that I've questioned Trump for 4 years and attacked him and got in trouble with the army for attacking him, right? That's forgotten. The fact that I dared to question his policy, okay, his record, the person who's going to lead the, quote, free world, I was told that means the following. A, I am working, right, subtly for the Trump campaign to get him elected. I have a secret MAGA hat in my closet, right? You name it, the conspiracies come out. And most of that conspiracy came from the polite left. And that's interesting to me because I'm a man, I guess, vaguely of the left. But I think that we have to be very careful about deciding what is a crime, deciding what is right or wrong based on who does it, based on whether we like the person or we like the color of the team of the person that does it. So I kind of challenge that. Biden has been a cheerleader for war, and he's been a sort of vanguard, right? A leader of the status quo throughout his whole career. He's been wrong a lot. However, and I said this in the podcast and nobody listened, he has had his moments, positive ones. And he actually, apparently, by most inside reporting, I'm talking of the Woodward variety and others, was opposed to the surge in Afghanistan that I got sent to, that Obama actually supported. And there are some interesting notes, for example, in Ambassador Holbrooke's diary, where Biden lost his temper and said, I'm not sending my son back over there, because his son at the time had been, I think, in Iraq, to protect women's rights or to build the democracy here, because it just won't work. And I think that Biden has flashes when his gut, because he's a gut player like Bush, right? He's a gut player. He says it, and he is. There are times his gut is better than others. And I want to believe, all right, I'm not ready to rest on that. I'm not ready to stop fighting, but I want to believe that he learned something from the Iraq War and from the last 19 years, and that he'll be a little more careful about, say, regime change or expansive wars. All that being said, there's almost nothing in his record to support it. That's a hunch and a hope, and we can't rest on that.
Right. Well, now, in terms of the big picture of what's happened in the world, Of course, we know that after World War II, the military-industrial complex got built up so terrifically during the war that they didn't want to turn that all down, and they had needed an enemy. And the Soviet Union, which wanted to actually be our friend, actually wanted to join NATO, but it was much more convenient to make them an enemy. When that crumbled, and the military-industrial complex saw the danger of an outbreak of peace, they scrambled around for other enemies like Noriega or, small-scale stuff. And finally, they came up with this great idea of the war on terror, something that would just keep, the more you fight it, the more enemies you get, the more money you can put into it. But even that, I think you're saying, is now running out of steam for some of you were saying in one of your podcasts. What do you see happening next in their hunger for more money for more weapons?
The military-industrial complex doesn't even need us to fight wars in order to make money. They just need the constant threat of war. It helps to fight them. They would like a bit of both. If you're Raytheon or if you're Lockheed, right? Let's say you make the Patriot missile defense system, right? It helps if we have troops deployed around the world that need top cover, right? That need, quote unquote, need aerial cover, right? Because you can make sure that you can ship the Patriot system to all of our troops overseas. However, you don't need just that, and you'd prefer to you want to diversify your market, right? These are capitalists, and I'm not very good at capitalism, but I read just enough to be dangerous. And how do you diversify your markets? Well, if you have perennial support for Israel, they'll always need to buy your Patriot missile system. But let's say that you have a new Cold War with Iran drummed up, right? Then you have to protect all the venal theocrats and kings along the entire Persian Gulf arc. So you got to sell them Patriot missile defense systems. But even better than that is if there's the possibility, right, just over the horizon at any moment for the entire Earth to end in an afternoon. And the best way to do that is to drum up a new and unnecessary Cold War with Russia and also with China. Because if you do that, then what you can do is you can sell the Patriot system all throughout Eastern Europe and all those new NATO countries, and you can also land it in Taiwan and Japan. Do you see what I'm getting at? I'm using one weapon system to explain that as we move forward, there is an alignment with American foreign policy to the needs of the military-industrial complex. And so we don't need to have 150,000 troops in Iraq in order to make sure that the defense budget grows and expands like the universe. The only thing in the American budget that is similar to the universe, I personally am not a bright enough guy. I'm not Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't understand how the universe continues to expand. Doesn't make sense to me. Where the heck is it expanding to? Doesn't matter if I understand it, because that's how the defense budget works. No matter how the economy is doing, no matter what's going on in the world, no matter how big or not so big the threats to us actually are, the defense budget expands. So it is a coincidence indeed, that's not a coincidence at all, that American foreign policy and the drum up of threats aligns almost perfectly with the bottom line of Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin. And one of the best ways to ensure that would be if we could get, I don't know, a former lobbyist for Raytheon to become the Secretary of Defense. I mean, that'd be a crazy dream. Oh, wait, that happened, okay? And he just got fired. So I think moving forward, you're gonna see less overt American invasions, okay? If I was a soothsayer, right? If I was talking about the Ides of March, okay, what I'd be talking about is we'll still have low-level American brush fire wars, special forces and advisors, and airstrikes across, the greater Middle East from Morocco to South Asia. But what you'll really see is an emphasis on allies and forward support, right? Forward deployment of troops for new Cold Wars, but this time a two-front new Cold War, like the 50s and 60s with Russia and China. That's what I see happening. The American people might actually buck. They might actually balk at another Iraq-style regime change invasion. So I think you'll see either party over the next few administrations being careful about that, being less likely to do it, but they will maintain the war state regardless. That sounds cynical, but I think if I was going to put money on it, the Vegas odds are with me.
I understand from the documents that came out from the Bush administration that there was discussion after the Soviet enemy kind of petered out of making China the new enemy, and the Walmart crowd said no way, and then they came up with the very clever war on terror, which was supposed to be kind of endless war. It has been, but now we're seeing that maybe a shift in that, and maybe China being prepped to be the next enemy and being prodded into their own nuclear arms race, which they weren't particularly planning on, but we're kind of putting them into that position of needing to do that. Do you see, regardless of a change in administrations, the danger of a growing rift toward China?
Oh, I think we have to take it very seriously. There's always been a lot of talk that our economies were too linked, right? The Chinese and the American economy were too coupled. And in fact, even more importantly, China's economy was too linked and coupled with the global economy. And so the idea was that, if, there's the democratic peace theory, two democracies don't fight wars. That's actually been challenged by a number of events. But there's this other theory that two inherently linked capitalist societies, because let's be honest, China is largely crony capitalist as much as anything else, state-directed capitalist. Whatever Pompeo says when he, plays like it's the 80s all over again and he's back at Westpoint, and he brings back all this Marxist-Leninist talk. Side note, I'd love to have a debate publicly on CNN with Mike Pompeo on the intricacies of Marxism, because I'd like to embarrass the valedictorian of the 86 class because he doesn't know what he's talking about. Nevertheless, I think this is important, though, because I've read a lot of interesting stuff lately, so from some serious scholars that show that in a historical sense, a lot of that is a misnomer. When Germany, we were talking about Armistice Day, right? When Germany and Britain went to war, okay, and in August of 1914, their economies and the European economy were actually as or more inextricably linked than America and China. And ideology and fear-mongering actually won out over rational capitalist free market thinking, okay? Which I think puts the lie to a lot of that notion that the market is a pure thing, right? That it is purely rational. I think that that's been belied by every historical event. So look, there is real danger that China will serve the purposes of the powerful, of the profitable, because it is the perfect enemy in a way, because it is so large, it is so intractable, it is so misunderstood. So I think you'll see a lot of fear mongering. It's a great way to keep the people in line. It's a great way for the government to maintain a hold of the economy through the military-industrial complex. And the problem is the Democrats were so anti-Trump, and they're going to continue to run against Trump for 4 more years, right? They're going to run against Trump until after he's dead. They are so anti-Trump, they'll do anything that's the opposite of what he did, okay? And so you see someone like Biden, who ran to the right of Trump in many cases on China, ran to the right of Trump in many cases on Russia, and I'm afraid they'll actually put some of that into practice. It is a dangerous thing indeed when the two major party candidates are debating an issue like Russia or China, and they're trying to out-tough one another, and nobody's discussing peace or coexistence. So that's a real fear.
Yes, well, that is an incredible point, I think, to open it up for questions, because that really touches all of us. So I'd like to see if any of you have questions. I'll turn it over to Melanie, who will handle some questions and answers from our audience.
Yes, Danny, yeah, very scary about China. And I'm hoping that this election, for those who voted for Biden, is a wake-up call. Yes, we cannot stop. We have to continue. Hopefully that's been a wake-up call. That's my feeling on that, and that's got to be the way. Okay, so now we have Bob Flax.
Well, thank you, Danny, for your work. Let me know when you run for office. I will vote for you. But having said that, I want to ask you about how you view the path to peace. It looks like through my eyes, it looks like there are kind of 3 main paths that different groups are pushing. In academia, peace and justice studies programs, you have the kind of Gandhian nonviolence, you have the culture for peace. That's kind of what they're putting out as the way to go if we all would just adopt it. In terms of kind of mainstream talk, there are treaties, arms reduction, treaties, multi-track diplomacy, the kind of tools that are out there now. And then there's the third group, which I view as the more visionary group, looking at things like world parliaments, world federation, bringing the nations together structurally and legally. How do you see peace coming about? Through one of those paths or through some alternative way?
So I think the first thing that's most important about your question, and it's a great question, is to talk about peace, to broach the subject. That is a radical thing indeed in the year 2020. You'll notice not only is there not a mass, at least publicly, popular and promoted anti-war movement, there's not even really much of a peace movement. Now, I don't say that to patronize the people on this call who have been working tirelessly for that when no one was paying attention largely, but it is a reality that we don't have the movement we had in, say, 1968 or 1972. We don't even necessarily have the movement we had in 1979, 1980, and 81 when Simon and Garfunkel were doing concerts, around ending nuclear war. I'm a very old soul. So I think broaching it is important. The three paths are interesting. So there's like the academic path and the Gandhian nonviolence. I'm amenable to the arguments. I think it's important. I have often been, and I'll get myself in trouble here, in a college town, the University of Kansas, I have been very frustrated by the paltry attendance, for example, of career academics in the streets. Okay, whether it was at the Black Lives Matter oriented protest that I stood in solidarity with for, every day of a month, that first month, and lots since. There were very few professors there. And even when I had like anti-Iran war rallies that I was keynoting here in the most, radical town in the Midwest, right? There weren't a whole lot of professors there. So I'm skeptical, right? And I want their support. We're not getting it oftentimes, although there are exceptions. Treaties and arms reduction I'm in favor of because they are a path or a step in the right direction towards the third element, right? I'll take small victories. I think we should not be getting rid, for example, of all of our nuclear non-proliferation treaties, which is going to be one of the worst things Trump is remembered for. Denying climate change, right, of course, is going to be his great legacy, but also that. And we didn't talk enough about it. We were more focused on his language, right, his coarsity, which was obscene. But it's all on the road to this global governance idea. And that's another thing people are too afraid to even broach. I have written extensively. One of my more philosophical pieces was called Horses with Gas Masks. And it was about World War I. That's where I started. I talked about the absurdity of that picture, right? That photo. Google it if you haven't seen it. That they made gas masks for their horses, okay? Because this was the transition point in technology, right? Between armored warfare and infantry warfare. And to me, that was interesting because it showed that human beings were capable of such horror and cruelty that we had to actually expect that, well, our horses are probably going to get gas too, and we've still got cavalry. But I've argued that December 31st, 1914 is a day we don't talk enough about. The war by that point is 4 months and 24 days old, give or take, right? 1 million soldiers are dead. 1 million soldiers are already dead. Okay, that should have been the end of nationalism. It should have made it obsolete. That's what I'm saying. And then we had nuclear weapons in the Second War, which kills more like 30, 40, 50 million people, mostly civilians this time, unlike mostly soldiers in the First World War. The ability and the willingness of a great democracy, the arsenal of democracy, to drop those bombs on men, women, and children, mostly women and children and old people, should have made nations, I would argue, obsolete largely. Now that's a radical statement, but is it rationally? Because the point is, if an individual dictator or president playing emperor can on a whim end the world in an afternoon, if that is possible, if we live in a world like that, then isn't a system of control, brotherhood, fraternity, you name it, some sort of global organization and structure the only way to ensure that we don't destroy ourselves in an instant? And given climate change, the long-term risk that isn't so long-term anymore, it's right in front of us. Nation states have shown their inability to tackle that in a collaborative way. And so I think that what you're describing is global governance. Now, how do we get there is the hard part. That's the rub. That's the trick. I wish I had the answer, but I do know it's going to come from the bottom. I do know it's going to come from a global demand for a change in the structure of our institutions. Because if we think that a Barack Obama with his hope and change poster, right? Let's assume he's the best of us, right? In terms of who became president recently. I don't care if Bobby Kennedy becomes president, right? I love some of his speeches, but if the thought that one figure is going to take us, right, towards that, is going to give up the nation state power, is going to challenge these institutions that fund their campaigns and that make sure that they get to hang out with the right people in Martha's Vineyard when it's all over. If we're waiting for that, I think we're remiss. So I don't know exactly how it's going to happen. I think it's going to be some sort of black swan. I think the people are going to surprise us. If this ends well, and I hope it does for the sake of having grandkids, which I'm skeptical of now, then I think it's going to have to be a people's demand, worldwide solidarity, cross-religion, cross-race, cross-ethnicity, realizing what I tell my kids, and I know I'm rambling, but this is important to me. I tell my children that they are no more valuable to me, or that their lives are not to me. Their lives are no more valuable and special than the Yemeni children my government starved yesterday and today. I think that's a radical thought that shouldn't be so radical. When people challenge me on that, they say you're a bad father. I don't think so. I still make French toast for my kids like everybody else. But I think until we recognize that I have more in common with the teenager fighting me who calls himself Taliban, ultimately, and that my kids have an equal value with, children starving, you name the place, then I don't think we get there. So that sounds, again, naive, idealistic, romantic. There's always been a little bit of that in me, or I wouldn't be on this call.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. Yes, good question, Bob. And that's beautiful. Yes, we're all equal. And the more people that realize that, the better. So let's go quickly. We have Jean Stevens. You're next. If you could unmute, please.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Daniel. Everything you say is just so right on. And I wish that you were on national TV tonight across the world. So my question is about Trump stonewalling right now and what's happening in the Pentagon with the new appointees and Pompeo's comment.
Joe Biden said it was embarrassing, and he kind of downplayed it. And there's value, I think, in bringing a sense of normalcy, right, in not causing additional panic. I understand that part of it, but I think that what we're seeing is something pretty profound. I mean, we saw over the course of 4 years the conspiracy mongering and the fact and intellectualism rejection that has long been a part of American society and has long grown in, like, say, the Republican Party, but not just, come to fruition, right? So in that sense, Trump and his administration as symptom rather than cause, but they really were ridiculous. And so when you've got somebody like Pompeo, who is my nemesis, by the way, I have a blind spot for the guy, so you will notice that, Machiavelli Mike, my boy. The fact that he can stare into a mainstream television channel and speak directly to the American people and say something as delusional, right, as where we're ready for a second administration, is not just embarrassing worldwide, it's frightening for the people of the world. I've met some of these people, and I'm sure many of you have. We are scary to them, and global polling year after year shows that they see the United States as the #1 threat to their national security. Now, part of the reason they see that is because we are the most active militarily, we're the only ones to drop nuclear weapons, but I think a main reason, and I will end here, but one of the main reasons for that is we are so inconsistent. We are frightening because they don't know what we're going to do next. We can't be counted on. And I think that Trump and his refusal to concede and have the normal process for, a handover of power has shown to them again that we are an unhinged actor. And that scares capitalist markets, if you're one of those kind of people, and it scares folks, right? It scares leaders, regimes, allies, enemies, you name it. And so I think that the damage from this transition is actually going to linger for, well, I don't know, maybe a generation. And it's super dangerous. I don't know if that answers exactly the question, but I think it's very disturbing. And we shouldn't downplay it either.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so next question, we have Joseph Ronca. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Yeah. It's a little complicated. I teach human rights and social justice. And whenever I talk about capitalism needing an enemy, that's why I do all these wars. And I quote Eisenhower, who said roughly every bomb made is theft from the poor. And then I say we're the biggest thieves. We produce 55% of all the weapons. I want to be very careful not to offend any veterans who have served in the wars. And I talk about the Vietnam days where some of my friends would stare down veterans, and it was really annoying to me because 70% of the veterans tended to be minorities. And I was a white man and went to Brooklyn College, got free tuition. And after I talk about this, most of my students that are veterans, they agree with me, they like what I say, but there's always one or two that tell me they were offended. And I don't know how to deal with that because, I don't know, I love them and I feel that they're treated like crap by the US government. And do you have any ideas, what could I say or do that doesn't offend the one or two? Or maybe they should be offended. I don't know. That's one question. The other question is, the United States went before the Human Rights Council on Monday. And it's nowhere in, it's like an historic event, and it's nowhere in even the liberal press. The New York Times didn't mention it. Democracy Now! Didn't mention it. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
First of all, my father went to Brooklyn College as well, so there's that connection. A lot of great City College graduates. Colin Powell, although I think he's been overrated. But you know, first of all, this is a tough subject, and there are two factors at work here when it comes to soldiers and offending, and how do you support them, but also tell the truth. This is not an easy thing. There is a sense of fear, and I'm not saying that you have fear, but I've had people tell me that, and I've sensed it, right, between the lines. In a civilian population, and particularly folks who didn't serve, there's a sense that, man, can I really question all of these issues without having been there, or am I going to constantly be told, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you weren't there? And I think that some of that is real. I mean, there are veterans who put that forward. There are also a lot of chicken hawk civilians who kind of foster it. Let's be clear, and I think anyone should be able to say this, but I know I can because they're my people, right? They're my tribe. The original sin of the soldier is self-righteousness. The original sin of the soldier is self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. Every human being, the best of human beings, is littered with flaws, and some of them are inherent and some of them are common. And I think that by me saying that, I'm not attacking soldiers. Most of my best friends remain soldiers, right, for my sins. But nevertheless, I think that that is important. So there are always going to be those veterans who equate critique of war with critique of troops. And how do we uncouple that? It's really dangerous. It's really difficult, and it actually squelches dissent. It even squelches meaningful debate. The fetishization culture that we've developed around soldiers after getting rid of the draft, that reached a climax in the Gulf War parades that were sponsored by Raytheon largely, that is a dangerous thing. And it's going to take veterans, not just veterans, but it is going to take veterans to do what I said in the beginning and to reject it. And to be big enough to say, no, let's have this conversation. I know that you're not saying that I'm a terrible person, but it also requires veterans to recognize that they were party to crimes. I want a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for America's veterans, right? Just like they had in South Africa, just like they tried to do in Liberia, right? With a little bit less success. I think there's value in that. I think that this is a dangerous thing. I don't know that there's a tactic you can use per se, because it is exhausting to constantly caveat, as I'm sure you feel the need to do sometimes, where you have to constantly say, look, I'm questioning this, capitalist drive to war, or the nature of the military-industrial complex. I'm not questioning you. A lot of this is lost in the mythology of the 60s, much of it made up, okay? The image of the spitting on the soldiers, right, and the bags of dog you-know-what being brought to the airport. That stuff happened, but it did not happen in the numbers that it's been described, right? That's historically been debunked. We have to stop thinking in a Vietnam lens. We have to stop looking at the two as inextricably linked. The last point about the Human Rights Council, well, we don't report things like that. There's no money in it. There's not a lot of audience for it. But we just had an administration, okay, and I am not someone who just focuses on Trump. I'm a systemic critique guy. But we did just have an administration that put sanctions on the International Criminal Court, that took away visas, that rejected all versions of international human rights law, NGOs, right? And encouraged our allies like India to kick out the Amnesty International observers. So this is one thing that I hope we can pivot a little bit better on moving forward. But the United States has to quit exceptionalism. We have to quit our exceptionalism. It is an addiction. When a person thinks that they are exceptional, when a person goes around saying, I'm exceptional, you know what we call that? Clinically diseased. That is a personality disorder. When a country does it, you know what we call it? Patriotism and Americanism. And so I think that until we actually reframe the culture, which was the subject of my last book, we're in trouble. Everything I just said is vague and is unsatisfactory, but I just want you to know that I agree, and I think it is a challenge. I wish I had a full answer, but it's going to require some veterans to be bigger ethically and intellectually.
I like that.
Thank you. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Melanie, I mean, I can probably run, I'm looking at the schedule, I can probably run 5 to 7 or 10 minutes over because
11?
I can probably run.
We could do like
Yeah, I'm saying I could probably run 5 or 10 minutes over if need be, because my speaking part at the next thing is until a bit.
Good. We could go to 11:11.
Yeah, that probably worked just right.
That would be awesome. Oh, good. Okay, well, we can relax a little bit, but now we have Jerry Tettleman. Your question, please.
Thank you, Melanie. Danny, I gotta say it's a breath of fresh air to hear you saying these things, and it's refreshing to hear someone coming out of the background, the Army of yourself, becoming a peace advocate. And I think we need more voices out there like yours. The question I have for you, I'm a longtime peace advocate. I was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, and I'm a longtime world federalist, and I've written a book about it. But I wanted to ask you, what really creates war and peace, the best example we have in our time is the European Union. Europe has been at war for thousands of years, 2 world wars, and now you have all of Europe that's within the Union at peace with each other because they've developed this institution which has a parliament, it has laws, it's brought civilization to Europe. And I see that as an example for the world that we can do something similar to that, a loose, form of government on a global scale. And I want to see what your thoughts were on that. The other thing is of democracies coming together. I see that the path to that is uniting the democracies of the world into a common protection, kind of like what NATO is, but more than that, an association of the democracies, because there is a danger, as we can see in any government, that governments can become corrupt, and democracy is probably our best defense on that. So I want to get your comments on that, see what you thought of the European Union, that model, how that's brought peace to the world.
The European Union gets a bad rap, I think. These are all flawed institutions because they are all made by men, right, or women, right? Of course, just men being the old term, right? We need to really ditch that. But this is a human endeavor, which means it is going to be littered with flaws, right? Martin Luther King may have plagiarized his PhD, right? Nobody is perfect, okay? And so we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are 2 paths of international association that we've seen in the West. They are the NATO path and the EU path. And the NATO path is problematic. And the NATO path is problematic because it is inherently martial and is inherently anti-Russian from the start. That was its genesis. That was its, right, raison d'etre, right? That was why it's there. It has standard ammunition, okay? There is NATO standard ammunition. That's what it said on the side of ammunition boxes that I used to load, right? Because the idea is a Dutch soldier can pick it up off the battlefield and use it. So that needs to be rejected largely, okay? The European Union, on the other hand, is a diplomatic, an economic, and a cultural association that encourages free travel. We know that that actually open borders and mobility, which is, limited by economics clearly, but we know that that kind of mobility and travel fosters open-mindedness. We know this, right? That the studies are out there. One of the problems with the United States is that what percentage of the people have been overseas or have a passport? It's a ridiculously low number for a relatively rich country. So I encourage that. I think that one of the advantages the EU has that is going to be really hard for America to get its head around is that there is more parity in Europe, right? Well, it's not perfect, clearly, but there is parity. There is balancing, right? You've got Germany and France and the United Kingdom, which, while Germany is the powerhouse, it is not a superpower, right? It is not a superpower. Hyperpowers and hegemony tend to throw these things off. Nobody wants to give up the big boy slot. It is actually important to be balanced and humble to a certain extent. America is really struggling with that. They call it the Thucydides trap, right? When another country is rising, the existing power gets really anxious and war is likely historically. So I think that we're going to have to look at the best elements of the EU. If it starts with the democracies, that's great. This is radical thinking here, but there are silver linings and benefits to even the rise of, say, China, Russia, India, you name it. In the sense that I think parity tends to be a positive thing. The reason people like to watch the NFL, beyond our love, and I'm guilty, right? Beyond our guilty pleasure love of violence, one of the reasons people like the NFL is that on any given Sunday, anybody can win. There's actually parity in the league. It is rare that a team goes 16-0. All right, that makes it interesting. And I also think that in a strange way, diplomatically, it can actually be a positive thing. Hegemony is problematic across the board. So I support something like that. The fact that Americans won't even broach the subject, in Congress, we've had one atheist, I believe, ever elected, right? Which is already interesting. But how many people have we had elected? Probably a pretty small number as well, who are even willing to discuss these issues, right? Discuss the idea of giving up aspects, right? Slowly, aspects of sovereignty for the greater good. I know this, climate and nuclear war may not and cannot be solved, right? To the extent that there's a solution. They cannot be solved by nation states running around, running after their personal best interest. These are human being-led organizations, and there's nothing more dangerous than a married man with a Facebook account, okay? How can we trust individuals, right, running their own interests as nation states, playing out this realist, hard-nosed Kissinger, geopolitics? We will ride that delusion right to extinction, and the fungi will laugh at us. So I think that in the end, what you're subscribing to is really the only rational way forward. So it's not naive. It's not naive. It is the only rational way forward. And my last point in my usual rambling digressions is that one of the great novels, great anti-war novels, that is assigned at Westpoint to this day and is often on the Chief of Staff of the Army's reading list, is called Once an Eagle. It's a great book because it's fooled soldiers for generations who think it's just a book about leadership, of being an officer, but it's really an anti-war book if you're even vaguely paying attention. And at the end, as he dies, and he's killed in a, quote, terrorist attack in Vietnam, the protagonist says to his mentor, the kid who's like, looks at him as a mentor, he says, Joey, he says, remember, he says, the spendthrift moral act is ultimately the practical one. The cozy dog practical move is the one that ultimately comes to grief. And to me, that's a clarion call for optimism and romanticism and a refusal to be apathetic or say it's unrealistic to broach these things. No, it is ultimately the practical act. And so I agree with you.
I love that. I love it. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for saying that. And now we have Michael Caruso. Please go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Danny, for the inspiration and I think amplifying, I think, what probably we all feel. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be on this call. But a couple of questions. I know there's at least 4 Rotarians on the call, and wondering if you're familiar with the organization and if you've ever been invited to be a Rotarian. And secondly, another person who has kind of gone along the same or similar parallel path as you have, who has gone to Westpoint, served in Iraq, retired as a captain, I believe, while he was in Iraq. Paul Chappelle, I was wondering if you know him. He's also a great peace activist and a Rotarian.
So I know less about Rotarians and haven't been, invited, but am very interested in learning more. So it's definitely contact me. Just looking at what's behind you, right? I mean, I'm sure I see a lot of things I'd like to talk about. I am familiar with that officer and I don't know him personally. I think what he speaks to is that there are way more, skeptical veterans, even if I stole the Twitter handle, right? There are way more skeptical vets than we know about. They don't make it onto TV. You have to claw your way manically and insufferably, like I have, to even make it into the D list with Kathy Griffin, right? And I'm fighting right there on the line with the C list, right? And so I'll occasionally get into the LA Times, and I'll occasionally get into broader outlets, but a lot of times it's something like Jimmy Dore, right, with 700,000 followers, but it's not CNN, right? So it has an impact, but it's not quite the same. So if I counted up all the captains that I know, right, guys that got out as captains, guys that got out as majors, guys that even are still in, who graduated with me, if I counted up the number that are similar to myself, and I believe Paul is his first name, it would surprise the average American how many of us are fed up with these wars. The question is twofold. How many are willing to speak out? Most are kind of fatalist, apathetic, and they just kind of wall themselves off. And I'm talking about most of my dear friends here, so this is not an attack. Wall themselves off. I can't change a system so big. The beast is too large. The military-industrial complex, it has a hyphen. You can't fight a hyphen system, right? And so there's this idea of like apathy and fatalism. So I wall myself off in my family and I can't do anything. And then the second one is that you have a lot of voices who do try to get active, and they're sort of silenced and suppressed. And in the process, they get, apathetic themselves, right? There's a sense of I can't change anything. So I think that one of the things we're trying to do at EMN, and it's only a small effort that I'm part of, is to try to highlight for the American people how many of their veterans are skeptical. What we do know is that, and it should be on the New York Times every single day until something is done, we do know that 73% of the veterans of the Afghan war are in favor of full withdrawal from that war. That's polling from conservative institutions. In fact, some Koch funded, okay? So these aren't like hippie polls. And we have never had a moment in American history, and I've looked at this pretty hard, where that number of veterans were utterly opposed to the war they had personally served in, while at the same time, the chicken hawks, right, in Congress are maintaining these wars endlessly in a bipartisan fashion. So yeah, I'm interested in more information about both of those things. And I think that the important element here is that, I'm not as much of an anomaly as people often make me out to be. And it would surprise the American people to know how many of my brothers and sisters feel almost exactly the same way.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. And we have one last question. It's from Barbara Gonmuller. Please unmute, and thank you, Barbara.
First of all, let me just thank you for being who you are and being brave enough to get out there and tell us the words that you have learned through experience and wisdom. My grandfather was a man who immigrated to the United States because he didn't want to serve in World War I. So I came up with this history that my grandfather said, you're going to be a peacemaker. So I married Robert Mueller, UN Secretary, Assistant Secretary General, who wrote 7,500 Ideas and Dreams for a Better World, who said, until we have world government, we're not going to have peace. And that scares people to death. To have world government, a way of making our world manageable so we all have a life of peace. So my question is, how can we say something? Give us a soundbite that says we can have peace and not scare people half to death, or we can have a government that survives. I started a company called United Nature. Everybody wanted to join because we looked at nature as a harmonious way to survive. Species working together, trees not, falling into the ocean trying to be a bird. I mean, nature is very smart. So United Nature was my way of trying to avoid that downfall of words. And so help us with the soundbite. And then I am president of the Rotary E-Club of World Peace. Why? Because we have 35,000 Rotary clubs. And my dream is that we will get them to finally talk about peace. So I'm going to invite you to join us on one of our upcoming meetings. We meet on Tuesday night. We're an E-Club, so you don't have to go anywhere. But I just love you. I just want, as a mother, a grandmother, and a peacemaker, I'm so proud of you. God bless you.
Well, thank you so much. I wish my mom was on the call hearing that. She's my favorite person and my ride or die buddy. And She was always saying that, like, she's my biggest fan, which I guess goes without saying. She also thinks I'm handsome, right? I tell women that all the time.
I agree.
No, I think that, look, in terms of sound bites, they're hard. They're hard because these are big issues and they're systemic and there's hyphens and all of that. And so people get lost in the minutia. And one of the things that's problematic about the professorial approach is that it's not approachable to everybody. It's not accessible to everybody. And people get bored. What I would say is this: more people across a variety of value systems and political ideologies agree with us than don't. And that whether you are religious or you're into secular saints, the words of somebody like Jesus, if we actually follow most of the red letters, or the secular saints like Oscar Romero or Eugene Debs, saying that while there is a lower class, I am in it; while there is a criminal element, I am of it; and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I once fooled a woman into thinking that was something Jesus had said, and this was a very educated woman. So my point is that twofold. Number one, all value systems, almost all value systems, align with peace. And the second one is that it is rational. It is the only way. It is not flighty. Okay, so come as you are, right? We will take you with, regardless of ideology, regardless of value system. For the most part, more of us agree than don't. So we're in good company. If I had a soundbite, we're in good company. Let's do something about it. And that was a long soundbite that will not make it in the advertising industry, which is why I insufferably pontificate about these things for a living and don't work in advertising.
No, you did great. That was fantastic. And that's beautifully said. Thank you so much. Thank you for your courage, absolute courage. And that's what we all need. We all need to do it together. We can do this together. Like you said, Danny, we're the majority, and it's not crazy. It's normal to want peace. So we're getting close to, we have 1 minute till the 11:11 for Armistice Day, and I'll send it back to Arthur. Arthur.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Danny. This has been really, really key. And I think your soundbite is exactly right. We're in good company. And you know, that's what Gary was also saying. He also says, you know, does world government scare you? You saw that in our movie. He says, it does me if it's the same old forces of power and money, you know, controlling things behind closed doors. But I think what he talked about, but what if we, the people, actually, you know, take seriously what the Declaration of Independence says? People have the right to institute government, not government with bombs and militaries and buildings and all that, but an internet interactive based thing where, and we should talk more about this sometime, where we create what Gary's called the people-powered planet, where when we take this nuclear ban, for example, we enforce it by, you know, by people saying, okay, this is illegal. You know, longshoremen aren't unloading ships that carry nuclear supplies. We're, you know, scanning products and not buying them and so on. There's power to the people.
Yes, look at the time, everyone. Let's
Yes,
take a moment.
Okay, 11:11. Here we go. We can celebrate.
Just imagine how those people felt at that particular time. 11:11. 11:11, everyone. The war is over.
The war is over. Yes, war is over. Yay!
Thank you, Danny. I guess you have to go. You have to run off, or we'll see.
Yeah, I'm gonna head off here in a minute. I'll just you know, being how I am, I will say that you know, there was that phrase, what if they gave a war and nobody came, kind of thing. And I've always said that the moment when the activists put the daisy, and it happened many times, in the rifle barrel is a more profound one than the cosmetic aspect of the photo can demonstrate. The photographer who took that original one, or one of the more famous ones, said that what he noticed was the National Guardsman's hand shaking, not sure what to do. That's not captured in a still photograph, but I think it's key, because what it shows is that when people use their bodies courageously, they force a choice. They force a choice, an ethical choice, on not just the powerful, but on the executors of policy, right? The foot soldiers. And these wars, this obscene policy that the hyper capitalists, as I call them, have taken to maybe our extinction, it can only happen if there are foot soldiers willing to do their bidding, foot soldiers whose class and ethical values do not align and their interests are not served. And sometimes it's violent and sometimes you become a victim. But when you put that choice in front of people and you force them to make it, it is amazing what can happen. And there's a lot of failures, but I think that the successes are worth it. And oh, by the way, they can't be done without. We can't survive without them. This is an existential question. And I want to thank you guys for having me, because I think that everyone in this organization and probably on this call and almost everybody listening was probably involved in these issues while I was still carrying water for the empire, right? When I was still playing Gunga Din, but with a gun, and probably before I was born in some cases. And so there's this idea in the streets now from some of the more ridiculous folks. They say, okay, boomer. And I always say, well, hold on a second. There were folks active laying the groundwork for you long before you were even conscious. And there were people in their parents' generation and before. There was a long thread of dissent. Dissent is patriotic. And that's my shirt. That's my book. And hey, thanks again for having me and letting me ramble on today.
Daniel, one last soundbite that I use is peace begins with me and starts with the conversation. And I want to thank you for the conversation right on that you gave us today. And I'm the speaker next week, so I'm going to carry on from where you left off. And I'm going to talk about what it meant when my grandfather immigrated here with $5 in his pocket. And he said, I was going to be a peacemaker. Then how does that coincidence happen that I meet Robert Mueller? You know, you think about it. And your life too. How have your coincidences formed who you are? And how much joy you bring to us that you have this philosophy and you're willing to put it out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that Barbara's going to be our speaker next week. And I just want, before you close, to let people know, how can Barbara contact you to invite you to be a speaker at Rotary? And how can we all buy your book? And how can we listen to Fortress on a Hill?
Yeah, so pretty simple. Fortress on a Hill, my podcast, is fortressonahill.com. And the best way to contact me, and I'll type it into the chat right before I get off. I have a website. It's skepticalvet.com. Hard to forget. It has a contact page, button for me. It'll send a direct email that I'll get, while I'm hanging out or watching documentaries, or playing with my kids. And also it has everything I write ends up there and links to both of my books. So find everything I do there. Always email me. I will get back to you. I answer every correspondence still. Sometimes it takes me a minute, but I'll get to everybody. And the last thing I'll say is, if you need or want speakers or people who are similar to kind of put these issues out, I'm pretty connected with this network of folks like me, and I have enough cool points with some of them that they will do as I ask, and I know they won't regret it. So thank you for having me, and let's stay connected and collaborate and fight this fight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
I better run. I got to go talk to the Veterans for Peace.
Very good.
Speaking of boomers, the Veterans for Peace.
Together. Thank you, Melanie and Barbara. And until next week, let's say goodbye for the People Powered Planet podcast. We love you. Barbara put in the best words of all. We really love you. So thank you, Danny, and we'll see you again.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.